A strong foundation. Even though moral and ethical foundations may be eroding, we should ask God to help us stay true to biblical values. Here's Gene.
There's no question, is there, that the values in our own culture are eroding? All we have to do is open our eyes and look around us. They're not only eroding, they're crumbling. And I would go even a step further, at least within certain segments of society, the values are totally disappearing. The foundations are disappearing. Now, this is a concern on the part of people that David is writing about in the midst of his own difficult situation. And this is what we read in verse 3. Here is the question. Here's the concern, and we can all identify with this. When the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? Now, we're not sure of the events here, but we certainly, from the psalm, can conclude that it was a time of uncertainty for David, uncertainty for the people. Obviously, there were attacks by the enemies. This was happening. And so the people were really giving advice to David, and here's what they said. Escape. Escape. Flee, in other words. Escape to the mountain like a bird. For look, the wicked string the bow. They put the arrow on the bowstring to shoot from the shadows at the upright in heart. In other words, let's get out of here. Run. Hide. Now, that isn't necessarily wrong, because there are times when we flee, and even in our own culture, our own situation, our own world condition, I can refer to countries where people are fleeing across the border because if they don't, they're going to be killed. There are Christians in certain segments of the world that are crossing borders to get out because the churches are being burned. People are being slaughtered. And no one in this room, and I certainly wouldn't, condemn them. But for David, that was not his moment. For David, it would be wrong to flee. And so he responds to that. In Psalm 11, in the very first verse, he said, right from the beginning, I have taken refuge in the Lord. The Lord is in his holy temple. I cannot flee from this situation. In essence, he's saying, I'm the king. And I'm the leader. And I can't flee. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes watch. He examines everyone. In other words, I've got to look to him at this moment in my life. And so, in essence, we have this principle. Even though moral and ethical foundations may be eroding, we should ask God to help us to stay true to biblical values. In this case, David was saying, even if I have to stay right here and stand up for those values. I don't know what may happen to my life, but I know that God is in heaven and he sees everything that's going on. Now, when you go to the New Testament, Paul may have been thinking about this very psalm when he penned these words to Timothy. In chapter 3, last letter he ever wrote, here's his prophecy. But know this, the difficult times will come in the last days. By the way, if the last days were 2,000 years ago, what about today? Notice what he says. For people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, without love for what is good, traitors, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding the form of godliness but denying its power, and that includes religious people. And of course here he says avoid these people. In other words, don't be a part of that. And so Paul is addressing the issue in the first century, which is certainly applicable to our century, to the time in which we live. That we need to be aware of this and certainly not allow ourselves to become a part of it. And it's interesting that David, at the end of this psalm, in verse 7, towards the end, he says, "For the Lord is righteous, he loves righteous deeds, and the upright will see his face." In other words, in essence, prophetically, he's saying, no matter what happens, we will see his face. And I'm inclined to conclude, though it's speculative, that as Paul penned the final words to Timothy, he may have been thinking of that phrase from this psalm when he wrote this: "Timothy, I'm already being poured out as a drink offering. I know it's going to happen. I know I'm going to die this time. First time, God had mercy, got me out of prison, even though I said for me to live as Christ, to die as gain. But this time, it's coming." And he says, "The time for my departure is close." And here are the words I wish all of us could say at the end of our lives: "I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith." In other words, I'm ready. And he goes on to say, "There is reserved for me in the future the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day." What day? The day when I will see his face. The very words from this psalm. And not only to me, but to all those who have loved his appearing. Powerful, powerful witness on the part of the Apostle Paul. Now, here's a question to think about. It says, in a world where spiritual and moral foundations are being destroyed, how did Jesus address this issue? I love the metaphors that he used. When he said this, therefore, Matthew chapter 7, this is from the Sermon on the Mount. "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a sensible man who built his house on the rock." I love that picture. That rock. And that's a metaphor. And of course, we know who the rock is. "Upon this rock I will build this church." And the rock that he was referring to was not Peter. It was basically the confession of Peter relative that he was the Christ. Jesus was the Christ. I've stood there, by the way, on the rocks in that evil section near Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus made that statement. And that whole area is solid rock. And Jesus made that statement to Peter and the other apostles. But by contrast, everyone who hears these words of mine and doesn't act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. We all know what is going to happen. But basically, the conclusion is that no matter what happens to our values, no matter what happens to the foundations as far as the world is concerned, even though they destroy the foundations that have made the nation great, there's a foundation that cannot be destroyed. And that's the foundation of Jesus Christ. So let's remember this principle to live by. Even though the moral and ethical foundations may be eroding, we should ask God to help us stay true to biblical values. And one of those biblical values is Jesus Christ, who is not only the cornerstone, but he's the whole foundation. And that foundation can never be destroyed.